I know, guys, it's been a while. We're kicking it old school in the For Cannon's Sake setup. Maybe that'll be returning soon. But on this subject, I figure it was a great time to actually discuss some things that we discussed on For Cannon's Sake. Let's get right into it. This is a post coming from Meg. I got tagged in this. Let's read it. It says the U.S. Toy Association is asking for an exemption because Trump's tariffs on Chinese goods has revealed that the U.S. no longer makes any toys. Instead of asking for a gay exemption, the U.S. Toy Association should put out a nationwide call to any people who have any skills related to toy making, get a government grant, that part I vehemently disagree with, and hire them to make toys for the country. Imagine the creativity and quality that would come out of it, and the meaningful work created for creative individuals in the country. This is a way to build a real economy rather than a fake economy. As of me recording this video, the U.S. Toy Association has not actually requested an exemption, though they have been against the tariffs, which to you may be just kind of splitting hairs there. I could personalize this just a little bit. I've talked about this before, how I was humbled when we tried to enter the toy and statue market, and you realize just how difficult it is to mass produce anything in the US related to that market. It doesn't matter how much money you have, the infrastructure simply is not there to mass produce. Even with this whole 3D print phenomena, it cannot be done at a mass production level. We're just not there yet. And another thing people seem to misunderstand is that this is something that applies to everybody that is in this market, which includes, of course, massive big corporate entities, but also smaller companies as well. People immediately think about like Hasbro and Mattel, but again, the smaller ones in pretty much every industry is manufacturing overseas if it's not available here in the US. And that's due to some factors, mainly with regards to the regulatory bodies in the United States of America. You simply can't produce affordable goods here in so many different industries, and that's unfortunate, but it's very easy to sit there and just blame like overseas. Everybody talks about cheap labor, but it's not simply that. And I think that it's almost like the government kind of wants us having that conversation and not really looking towards them to look at how they kneecap the American people in several different industries. So let's talk about how we got here. Up until about the 80s, the United States did largely manufacture their own toys. This is something that progressively started to happen going into the 80s, and in the 90s, just really exploded. And now we're here far many decades removed from it, which is why this is not going to be solved with just a light switch, like flipping it on. It didn't happen like that. And like I said earlier, though cheaper wages is something that people are going to focus on, I totally understand why people bring that up. It's not the only thing, especially when you start to consider how much it costs to like ship things from overseas on the boats. Dude, the costs start to add up. It's not simply about the labor. When trying to like really conceptualize how much something costs, it's all encompassing. It's not simply the labor. So we're here where we're at now, where I believe 80%, which is a crazy number, of the toys that are sold in the U.S. are produced by China. They're manufactured by China. The rest are manufactured by countries like Vietnam, India, Mexico has some as well. So for several decades, the U.S. has completely just abandoned manufacturing toys and statues. So how we got here is very important. And it really started with, as I mentioned, late 70s going into the 80s, where safety started to be this thing that people are hyper focused on. Again, I'm not saying that people shouldn't focus on that. I'm saying that it led to this over regulation and it just killed domestic production. One regulation leads to another regulation, which leads to another. And again, here you are. A lot of this started with 1978, where you had that first big lead paint ban. And I believe it was, I can't remember the actual percentage of what it was, but basically they said that you could not produce toys or really anything that had this certain percentage of lead in it. Again, not saying that is inherently a bad thing, but actions have consequences, especially if the manufacturers were relying on that in the past. There also were these various like solvents and additives that ended up getting banned in U.S. manufacturing. But guess what? China isn't beholden to those sort of rules. So while you couldn't produce certain things like that had particular dyes in the US, you could still import it. Now, I know that some of you might bring up like some of the testing standards when it comes to these different things. And sure, that's a thing. However, they're not as strict on, of course, the imported goods as they are with the US manufactured stuff. It's mainly because they don't have any sort of imprint, like they can't control necessarily what China is producing. They're also very inconsistent with the enforcement. So what that led to is China basically being able to mass produce things, even if they were cheaper, right, in terms of the quality, that the US simply couldn't. Another thing that I think people sleep on is with manufacturing, yes, like how things are specifically manufactured, there's a bunch of crazy like IP laws that the US has. So yeah, they have to get these approvals, they have to maintain certain like compliance, and they have to meet these ever-changing standards all the time. So you can understand why most companies were like, just screw this, I'll just get it imported. I'm not going through all of this. And again, China does not have to follow those rules. And by the way, this like manufacturing stuff also applies to the other country. A lot of things get imported from Japanese like IPs that many of you that watch my videos know and love. Well, guess what? Almost all that stuff is produced in China as well. And I'd also be very, very careful, not saying that there aren't people that will be okay with it, but just thinking that, okay, well, we shut it this way, or the people are talking about tariffs and what have you. Well, people are going to be willing to spend more money is what some folks would say. It's like, oh, well, because it's produced in the U.S. Look, I say this as a business owner. That sounds very well. We, for example, with the Rippaverse produce our books out here in the United States. Pricing is going to be impacted. And we're always constantly having to explain not only to our customers, but potential ones as well, why our stuff is priced the way that they are. And yeah, people are always going to say they'd rather spend less, but not sometimes understanding that a lot of what you want for a less price, or rather you're comparing, especially to bigger companies, you got to understand where that stuff is produced. And if people just stopped getting it produced from overseas, well, that means that the cost of your goods are going to go up. So there's a lot of harsh realities from both the consumers as well as the producers or companies that they have to face. And as I keep trying to reiterate, this is not something that is going to get fixed overnight. It's going to take a lot of time because, well, that's how we got in this position in the first place. I would absolutely prefer that more things are produced here locally. I mean, that would help a lot with speeding up production times and also being able to just keep tabs on the manufacturing process. But for so many different industries, especially the toy one, it's just not viable right now. And a lot of that is because of your own government. So while I would love for this problem to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed, we got to start looking to the United States government and how they are just, again, crippling their own people.